We've got a little bit more time with author Dan Black. Dan, we're going to talk about the Somme offensive, one of the bloodiest of the First World War, in just a minute. But I want to talk to you about your personal connection to that battle, because your grandfather was there.
Yes, my grandfather was on the Somme in the Battle of the Somme, and so that's 1916. He was serving with the 73rd Battalion, which is the Royal Highlanders of Montreal. And so that's with the 4th Division. So the 4th Division was the youngest of the 4 divisions. And so the 4th Division arrived in the Somme later than the other 3 divisions. And that's where my grandfather was wounded. He was on a patrol, and he was hit by a shell fragment, and it tore into his right leg. And he was eventually found. I think after like 24 hours, he was pulled off the battlefield, and he was eventually taken to a casualty clearing station in a place called Comté, which isn't too far from that battlefront. And that's where his leg was amputated below the knee there, or just above the knee, actually.
Private Clarence Black was his name.
Private Clarence Black. Yeah.
And he was with you till you were how old?
Well, he passed away when I was 15. So he died fairly young. He was in his 70s when he passed away. And he didn't talk about it. He was rather stoic. We asked a few questions once in a while, but he really didn't talk too much about it. He didn't even talk to his son about it, my father, very much. It was just a silent thing. But anyway, the conditions were right. We were at the cottage in Quebec, just north of Ottawa, and we were sitting in there, and it happened to be raining outside, so everybody came in the house. And my mom had lit a couple of lanterns just to, add a bit of atmosphere. And we were just sitting in there. We were going to actually start a board game or a game of cards, and the whole family was there. And Clarence was there, and he was sitting I remember he was sitting in a green basket chair near the window. And somebody said something, and he just started to talk about the conditions on the Somme. And it may have been the rain, because at the time the 4th Battalion moved down there, so October 1916, the conditions on the front had just changed completely. I mean, the trenches were waist deep in slushy, icy water. So maybe that's what brought on the memory. But he started to talk about it, and for about 15, 20 minutes, we just sat there mesmerized by what he was saying, about the men being huddled up in their ground sheets with the rain pelting down. And he even described, I think, a sniper getting one of his buddies. And then he talked very briefly about going out and being wounded, but he didn't get into the details of that. I pieced that together years later.
So it was the only time, it was a couple of years before he passed, that he told you this story, that this cottage story tells. It's the only time you ever talked about it?
Only time that I ever remember him talking about it. Although when we were kids, we used to go, he was a member of the War Amps of Canada. He was, in fact, a treasurer for the Ottawa chapter. And we used to, as kids, go to this Christmas party. And so we're at this Christmas party, and there's all these men in there with, missing arms and legs. And of course, all their grandchildren were there. But one thing I do remember about that is none of these men talked about it either. They talked about their grandkids. It was, yeah.
Just remind us how devastating the Somme offensive really was.
Oh, it was very devastating. I mean, if you look at sheer numbers, and I know that's not the whole story, but the British, I think they lost 432,000, had 432,000 casualties in the 4 or 5 months of the Somme. The French lost 270,000 casualties, but if you add the French casualties with the casualties at Verdun, which the Somme was all about trying to take pressure away from, the French lost 850,000. So the numbers are astounding. I think the Germans were well over 600,000. Some say as high as 670,000. So it's a huge, vast number of men.
What was Canada's contribution?
Well, Canada arrived, the first battle on the Somme would have been early September 15th is when they went into the line, into the main part of the line, although there was activity before that. Canada lost, the casualties for Canada were over 24,000. And not all of those are fatal casualties, but we paid a huge price on the Somme. But it was also, I guess some lessons were learned there too. It's where Canadian troops really sort of began to sort of develop this reputation for being shock troops. They were, the go-to guys when some things happened. So yeah, the casualties were crazy. I mean, and if you look at, historians today are still arguing about, Haig and the question of whether this Battle of the Somme was worth it, Douglas Haig. And, some have been very unkind to Haig, and perhaps rightly so, for the fact that he wasn't able to sort of reassess the battle as it was progressing. It became this horrendous battle of attrition. It was a mass butchery on a scale that had never been seen. In fact, the horrors from the Somme, I would argue to say, are sort of is the standard of which other battlefield horrors are kind of like measured against, because it was a tremendous loss of life.
As historians battle this out and debate how to characterize the Somme, how do you look at it?
Oh, that's a good question. It's part of war, right? And they didn't have hindsight. They had to go and do it. They had to do what they had to do. I mean, you could sit back and say, no, they shouldn't have done it. But I guess where I sit is there would have come a point, I think, where logic kicked in. And when the rains started in October, maybe that would have been the time to say, look, enough's enough. We've lost too many here. But no, they kept going right till into November, late November.
Dan Black, appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.